Still with me in the studio, I have Professor Bola Akinterenwa, Director General, Bolitag Center for International Diplomacy and Strategic Studies. Yemi Adamolekun, Executive Director in Office Enough, Professor David Awurawo, Professor of International Relations and Strategic Studies at the University of Lagos, Nigeria, and Modele Sharafa Yusuf, veteran journalist and Arise News analyst. Now, companies providing digital services to local customers in Nigeria will now start paying 6% tax on their turnover. According to Nigeria's Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning, Zainab Ahmed, the new law applies to foreign companies that provide digital services such as apps, high-frequency trading, electronic data storage, online advertising, among others. She made the announcement during the public presentation and breakdown of the 2022 budget in Abuja, explaining that the tax collection is in line with the provision of the 2021 Finance Act, which empowered the FIRS to assess company income tax on the turnover of a foreign digital company. The 2021 Finance Bill was signed into law by the Nigerian president on 31st December 2021, and it takes effect from 1st January 2022. My guest at this point to discuss these issues is the former Director General of the Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry, LCCI, Dr. Muda Yusuf. Dr. Yusuf, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Dr.
Yes, well, let me phrase it this way, because the Finance Act, we've just isolated one item. There are about 10 items that are controversial, including education tax, including the directive that the FIRS can collect, tax, be in charge of assessment for the federal government. And the 10th point, in that Finance Act, the point that, look, borrowing is allowed. All tiers of government can borrow. But first, let's start before we go into the details, including Section 17 of the Finance Act that talks about tax on carbonated drinks and the implications and all of that. Let's start with the budget itself. It's called the budget of economic growth, right? And consolidation and sustainability. Now, how much of a budget of economic growth and sustainability is this, in your view? Considering the basic indicators, projection of over 4% GDP growth, even when over 3.6% of that will go into debt service, and then, of course, benchmark of about 413 foreign exchange rate to the dollar, production of oil, 1.8 million barrels per day, even when we cannot even do up to that. We're not meeting the, OPEC quota, that production quota that we have been given. What's your assessment of that budget to start with, before we talk about the Finance Act?
Generally, we look at the budgets from two angles or two major perspectives. There is the appropriation component, which is appropriating the resources of states. That is the allocation of funds to the MDAs and all of that. And there is the policy component of it, which borders on some of the things that are in the Finance Act. Well, the budget is becoming more or less like an annual ritual, actually. But having said that, it is a tool to appropriate resources, to ensure and also let the public know how the funds of government are spent and allocated. But the challenge that we often have with the budget, first the assumptions, some of which we have related to. We have the assumptions on the foreign exchange, for instance. We need to look at the validity of some of these assumptions and how sustainable they are. We are talking about foreign exchange rate of 410, as stated in the budget, 410 to the dollar. And we all know what the naira to dollar exchange rate is. I don't think that is sustainable. I don't think that is good enough. I think this is something we can adjust a lot more, especially when we are talking of a budget that is struggling with finances. We talk about the output assumption, oil output assumption of 1.8. For the past few years, we have been struggling to meet that. I think the best we did the last 2 years was about 1.6 million barrels to the dollar. Again, we can look at. But generally, one is concerned about the aspirations as it relates to revenue. Because year in, year out, one of the biggest challenges to the budget is the capacity to fund the budget. Last year, that's 2021, we had a revenue budget or expectation of about 8 trillion. We were able to get actual revenue of about 5.5 trillion as at November. So the performance around the revenue was just about 74%. That is even better than what we used to have. Of course, the expenditure is very easy to spend. Performance in terms of expenditure was about 94%. So, of course, we have a very huge issue with the deficit and the debt. The debt provision for 2021 was about 3.5 trillion or 3.8 trillion. But the actual, as at the time the finance minister was presenting, was about 4.2 trillion. And that is for debt service. And one very striking point in that is that 1.1 trillion of that is an interest payment to the CBN for the ways and means. That is quite significant, because if that also underscores the amount of funding that we are getting from the CBN to support the budget. And of course, that has a lot of implications, particularly around inflation. So there's the issue of the sustainability of the budget and the assumptions and the capacity to fund this budget. So that is a major concern. Of course, we all are aware about the challenges the issues that were raised by the president himself when the budget was brought to him for assent. How the National Assembly had added over 6,000 new projects, and how they have, reduced the allocation to about 10,000 projects. How some revenues have been bloated up and all of that. These are very serious concerns that were raised by the president at the point of signing the budget. Of course, he said he was going to revert back to the National Assembly, but that is neither here nor there. But even on that, I think there's a need for a clear constitutional interpretation as to who exactly has the final authority on appropriation. Is it the National Assembly or is it the executive? I think there be a need for a judicial pronouncement on that to interpret Section 80, 81 of the Constitution as far as appropriation of funds is concerned, so that we can lay to rest. Because we have been on this for close to 15, 20 years, where there's always this disagreement between the executive and the legislature.
Well, but under the the doctrine of the separation of powers, an appropriation bill is a proposal. And I think I had a conversation last week on this with Senator Ajibola Bashiru, who is the spokesperson of the National Assembly. And he said, look, it's a proposal. An appropriation bill is a proposal. And that the National Assembly, which has oversight functions, has the right to also make an input into it. And that there will be negotiation between both arms of government. But the executive arm of government is saying that key elements within that budget have been reduced, including emolument salaries for policemen, and that the executive would take up that issue. But I was going to ask you, this is a deficit budget, 6.39 trillion or thereabouts. And the minister was very clear, Minister of Finance, in saying this will be funded through borrowings. What's your position on that?
Well, I think there is a lot of concern around the rate at which we are borrowing. In 2021, for instance, both the debt service, which was 4.2 trillion, and personnel costs were higher than even the actual revenue. In other words, we are in a situation where the revenue is struggling to even cover the recurrent expenditure. I don't think that is good enough. We cannot be running a system where the entire revenue will be consumed by recurrent spending. And to the extent that even the revenue cannot properly cover the recurrent, that means that whatever is borrowed will also be used partly to fund the recurrent. For me, that is not a sustainable framework in terms of managing the economy. So there's a need to review this, although the minister has said consistently that the issue we have is not a debt problem, but it's a revenue problem. But I have also argued that if you have a revenue problem and you cannot meet your expenditure, you cannot service your debt effectively, then effectively you have a debt problem. So there's a need to deal with these issues both on the revenue side and on the expenditure side. The government has been a bit aggressive, a bit bullish as far as raising revenue is concerned. And that's another thing that is of concern to those of us in the private sector. Because the private sector possibly now is even overstretched. I'm talking of those who are already in the tax net. They're overstretched as far as this tax payment is concerned. And when we talk about this tax, it's not just about the company tax and the VAT and some of these regular taxes. There are a lot of fees, licensing fees that all these businesses pay to the regulators. There are a lot of taxes from the state governments. There are taxes from the local governments. And there are all manner of unofficial taxes here and there. So the pressure on businesses as far as taxes are concerned, I think is something that we need to look at. And now that the government is pushing practically all the MDAs to go and generate revenue, at the end of the day, an additional pressure will be put on the private sector and on investors. And if you are running an economy where we are talking about generating more employment, taking people out of poverty, the president has consistently said we want to take 100 million people out of poverty in 10 years. You cannot take people out of poverty if the investors cannot expand, if the investors are going down under the weight of not just the very difficult operating environment, also under the weight of all these taxes. So we need to balance out all of these things. But coming to the specific issue of debt, I think it's something that we need to look at critically. Even the minister said it in the breakdown of the budget that she did, that in the outgoing year, 76 debt service to revenue was 76%. And she said it's one of the highest around the continent here.
Yeah, but
so she acknowledged that.
Yeah, but the debt management office says it's not a problem, that is sustainable. So, I mean, the debt management office, they are the ones who define the framework for all of this.
Well, they are not the only, because if you have a situation where your revenue, 76% of your revenue you are using to service debt, you don't need to be an economist to know that that is not sustainable. You can look at that either from a personal level or even from a business level. Yeah. So these are issues, and I think we need to look at that properly. And of course, when you talk about the Finance Act, the whole idea of the Finance Act is not a bad idea. Because annually...
there are taxes there.
Yes.
Now, if you sell shares worth 100 million, you pay tax. If you are involved in education activities, you pay tax. Yeah. There's something they call science and engineering levy. You pay tax. Section 17 says you pay tax even on carbonated drinks. What are the implications?
So the implications are quite enormous. For instance, let me say that there are too many taxes to start with. You have the Police Trust Fund levy. You have this technology levy or tax. You have the education tax, which was also increased in this Finance Act.
From 2%, right?
Yes,
to 2.5%.
To 2.5%.
Yes.
And you also have another one in the works, which is tertiary health institution tax. It's going to be levied again on companies. So you have too many of these things. And even those who are tax professionals have argued that we should harmonize these things so that it will even be easier for businesses to be able to relate with. Then we have this tax on soft drinks. Now already, the price of these soft drinks have gone up by as high as 50% in the last 1 year. And this is a product that is consumed largely by the ordinary Nigerians. I mean, if you look at these artisans, Okada riders, construction workers, by the time they buy this agege bread, they will get going and get a bottle of this soft drink, that is their food, possibly for the whole day. You know, so when we now come and say maybe because of diabetes and all of that, we're imposing a tax on it. And the tax is on the production. The tax is on domestic production. That is what excise tax is. And whether you make profit or not, once you produce it and the product is getting out of your premises, you have to pay that tax. Now that's a dilemma. If you pass on the tax to the consumers, there may be resistance. There may not be. Again, depending on what you call elasticity of demand. If there is a lot of resistance, the investors will have to bear that. And already the burden on investors is huge enough. Even at a time like this, what I even expect, at least from the authorities, is to acknowledge the fact that, just as the SEN said, there's already a lot of burden on Nigerians. And we should at least start from that premise to acknowledge that the prices of goods and services have gone beyond some unimaginable levels. And it's aggravating poverty. Ideally, we should come to the table on what exactly we are going to do to alleviate this. We know what inflation is, and not just the official inflation figures. Official inflation figures as at November was 15.4%. But if you look at the basket of goods that the common people consume, you'll be talking of inflation rate between 50% to 100%. I mean, take a survey of the market, especially of the staple foods, ingredients and things that the common people take. So the situation is bad enough. If you cannot alleviate the sufferance, it is unfair to add to it at this time. So for me, there's a major issue with timing. There's a major issue with the fact that this is going to be borne largely by the ordinary people. You know? So some of these things, I think we need to relate a lot more to stakeholders and the National Assembly that also passed the bill. I'm not sure they give sufficient room even for engagement or for public hearing. Because the speed at which the bill was passed, it was almost at the speed of light. Before we knew what was happening, it has been passed, they have gone on recess, it has been transmitted to the president. When even the stakeholders, the manufacturers associations, the chambers of commerce were complaining that, because this proposal has been on the table for some time. It started with the Nigerian Customs. During the interaction with the National Assembly, it was supported by the finance minister.
Okay.
So some of these things, I think we need to do a lot more engagement, and we need to be a lot more sensitive to what is happening.
Okay, all of these concerns that you have expressed, do you have the same concerns with regard to the plan to remove fuel subsidy by June this year?
Well, for this fuel subsidy, that's a bit tricky because from a purely economic perspective, there's a very sound economic case to be made. But again, we have to put it in context so that the shock on the system and the shock on the citizens will not be too much. Because already the citizens are on edge. Because first, the spike in prices. Second, the sharp depreciation in the currency. These two factors have devastated not only business, but even the citizens. So if we are coming with this major proposal, which economically makes sense, the strategy for the transitioning has to be properly well thought out. Just as Labour said, Labour too is not against it as such. But Labour is looking at the best strategy. And one of the things to do or to work towards is to ensure that we scale up domestic production or domestic refining. So perhaps that is why the date for the transition to the deregulated regime or removal of subsidy was fixed at July. Hopefully, by which time, we expect the Dangote refinery to have come on board. And we also expect possibly the government-owned refineries to also have come on stream. If that happens, the burden of the subsidy will not be as much as it is now. The burden is so huge now because we are importing practically everything that we consume as far as petroleum product is concerned. And I must say that is also a major indictment on the government. How can we, for over a decade, not be able to get refineries to work? That is not good enough. I mean, it's not rocket science. We have done several turnaround maintenance, gulping billions of dollars, and yet there is no result. Then secondly, because of political reasons, next year is elections. To remove subsidy this year, whether it's either in July or after July, I think politically it may be very, very difficult to do. By the time the strategies within the ruling party weigh in on it and all of that, it may be difficult to push through the issue of subsidy. That is my assessment of the situation.
Okay, finally, I mean, recently the president of Nigeria, Muhammadu Buhari, granted 2 major media interviews. And in at least one of those interviews, he scored himself highly in terms of the C agenda. The E in C is the economy. He says he has done very well, he has done his best. I mean, you have been monitoring the Nigerian economy for decades. Do you think that the Buhari administration, in spite of the 2 recessions and other variables, has done very well in managing the economy?
Well, I wouldn't say that the administration has done very well, given all these critical indicators, particularly indicators that relate to the welfare of the people. Because economics is not only about GDP. It's not only about some of these macroeconomic metrics. It's also about the welfare of the people. It's also about the prosperity of businesses, particularly the SMEs. If you look at it from those 2 critical angles, I'm not sure we can rate the president high. But having said that, I think from the point of view of strategy, I think the media handlers of the president should focus a lot more on something like a State of Union address, where a proper comprehensive speech will be prepared, he will read it properly and walk away. Because when it comes to this media interview, sometimes even the president is not able to articulate properly even the achievements of the administration. So I think we need from a point of view of strategy, if you want to discuss the economy, it's better to call the minister in charge. If you want to discuss infrastructure, let us engage with somebody like Fashola. He'll be able to tell us a lot more about what the administration is doing. If you are talking about transport, you can call Amechi. If you are talking about finance, you can call the finance minister. That way, the citizens will get a better feel of what the administration is doing, because one should understand the strengths and weaknesses of his principal. If you know that your principal is not so strong in the area of this impromptu, you play down on that, because it's not good to showcase what is the weakness. We should be showcasing the strength of whoever is the leader. So I think from a strategy point of view, I think that is what I will advise the media strategist of the presidency to be doing.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Muda Yusuf, for joining us on this Day Live, the Sunday Talk Show.